And as a housekeeping reminder, so I did start the recording. We're going to give it maybe another minute, but we want to make sure we give ample time to return to our community review and feedback of the patient profile from the CA Core Plus project. For folks that have just been kind of joining in this session or in the last few, we do have a recording around our approach to how we're going to be conducting the review and our processes that's available on our YouTube channel. I'm going to put that in the chat as well as a couple more links that are coming your way. There was an initial review last week where we kicked off the review of the CA Core Plus patient profile against the CA baseline constraints and started to review it for feedback of some of the modeling decisions. So that's available on the YouTube channel as well. One of the housekeeping items that I was just going to bring up to date. So I'm going to do my best to, when we're doing the review, I'm going to be playing the role as one of the authors that has put out the content and did the translation between the requirements and the profiles. I'm wearing the hat of talking to you folks through particular decisions, being available to answer questions that we have, and to try to facilitate feedback around some of the particular areas where, you know, in doing the comparison against the baseline, we want explicit feedback on. The goal is to allow for it to be free form and to provide feedback on any item as from a community perspective. But there are some places where I think it might be helpful. So my role is to kind of walk through and to kind of share some of these rationales and to help facilitate from an author perspective. Elliot has volunteered to help us kind of separate our roles a little bit more in being the scribe for the Excel sheet in the coming Friday. So he's not available this Friday, but like the goal being that we're capturing feedback as we go along and do this review, and it can be helpful to have kind of that secondary person playing that separate role. So that's just kind of a housekeeping item. Just for folks that are going to be joining us next week as well. We'll work out the logistics of what that looks like. But for today, I'm going to drop some more links in the chat because we're going to be returning to patient. And we want to make sure like we're letting folks know if you are you know, reviewing the content along with us as part of our community review and feedback. Oh, sorry, you might just need to go on mute. I think that might have been Dean. So if you are following along and wanting to provide feedback on the CA Core Plus profiles as an individual or your organization, basically independently of the feedback that we're going to be providing as a community, the details on how you can find the content and how you fill out the Excel spreadsheet, that's all available on this first link here. I've got the spreadsheet pulled up, so I won't go through the process of downloading it on the call. But like if you're looking at, you know, how do I go and actually find the content that we're reviewing? There's really two ways of doing it. There is a long way and a short way. So the long way is you can navigate to the project on Simplifier. You go to the project main page and it'll have a hyperlink for the draft release version of this guide. Or you can go to the versioned URL, which is the last link I've put in the chat, that will have all of the stuff that has been locked down and stabilized for the 0.1 draft ballot. So it's a versioned URL that allows for us across our kind of specifications to have kind of releases that like are snapshotted and that folks can review, and we have that kind of historical capture over time, in addition to like continuous integration builds. I'm going to go straight to the guide as part of our review today. So as a recap, we started patient last session. Thank you for bearing with me as I got over my cold. A little better today. So I wanted to actually start with a recap of, I listened back to the recording and I captured what I thought was the initial things that were changes that we definitively said, hey, this is a change request that we want, or a technical correction. Started capturing some of our review notes. There are a couple areas that we started discussing, but we didn't land on a definitive, this is the feedback that we want to provide as the CA baseline community. So like I thought in terms of priority, we might go back to that review and then return to our discussion to see if we do want to put forward a explicit request in relation to the current modeling that's on patient notes and the current modeling that's on patient.name extension. And then we'll just kind of go through the remainder of things programmatically down the list of specifically looking at kind of mappings and modeling decisions that have come from the interpretation of the PCH DCF attribute definitions into FHIR for patient. Any questions on this before we jump in? Okay, so the first thing I just wanted to kind of pull in front of folks is just to show you the content that I'd captured from the last session's recording. So we had started to look through the must support flags because there is no cardinality constraints that are in place right now to compare against with the patient profile in CA Core, given the fact that we're doing purely kind of an attribute mapping at this point in time. But you know, we did look at that must support flag on patient name and patient birth date, and we identified it has that kind of match to the CAN-SAND and no error obligation on the same elements. There is one or two more things I think it would be helpful for us to kind of, when we're doing our comparison, to look at. So I've highlighted it in yellow because I think it's kind of still kind of an outstanding item before completion. The one piece that I did capture as a discrete request from last session was to correct, there were some areas where we were missing a mapping within the actual JSON for a given element. So we had identified that in text, but in the actual comment, I put text and any others that are conveyed on the page, which I think was what Vinny had mentioned last time. So the way that I'm trying to kind of capture this is, you know, as we have comments and commentary that we're just kind of providing on the call, we're capturing, as well as the distinct kind of like requests for corrections or typos or changes, calling out, you know, the specific page that it's occurring. How we're filling out the sheet is we're saying on behalf of the CA FHIR baseline community, we're providing our commenter, like this is the specific email, and then as our comments and our feedback is dispositioned, we'll circulate it back to this group and have that be part of the collaborative process. But we just, one of the decision points that we made earlier on was that we didn't want to uniquely identify any of the individual the requesters, but rather submit on behalf of our community. So when I just as a pure process standpoint, are we comfortable with the one I don't have highlighted in yellow? Like this conveys what we were anticipating and asking for in terms of a correction. Or I should say, is anyone not comfortable with how we phrased this kind of comment and ask for the correction of that, those items? Okay. I didn't anticipate it, but I want to make sure. And then the next question is, you know, we've looked at patient name and patient birth date and done that must support comparison. I want to just to close out this part of the review, because we said part of our approach was comparison against our existing constraints. But a second part of the review was looking at the modeling decisions and providing feedback on that perspective. There's one invariant that I kind of want to make sure that we're flagging and we're all aware of, that is in both the core profile and in the base profile, but they're slightly different because of the nature of where the base profile is in its, you know, its current kind of modeling and the use of its constraints. So I'm going to just show that so we can kind of review it as we're going and decide whether or not we think that's something that we have an opinion around strengthening in particular, or if it's something that, you know, we're comfortable with kind of as it is. So yep, go ahead. Is there a comment? Okay, if not, so I've got the patient profile pulled up on the left-hand side for the CA Core 0.1. And then we've got the baseline profile for, and this should be like our CI build version of the profile. And this has...
Can you make the one on the left just a little bit bigger?
Yes.
Thank you.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. Thanks.
Okay. So we looked at the, and I'll close up some of my extensions and my slicing so we can see. We looked at these against the kind of CAN-SAND and no error last time. Now on the core profile has a lot more additional obligations for elements that some of which we originally had must supports on for the baseline, but had to kind of scale back because there were a use case here and there that didn't include it, and therefore, according to our principles, we had to be a little bit more relaxed. But when we're reviewing it from, you know, the perspective, kind of like a due diligence review, the things that we're really looking for is, are there things that we have constraints in the baseline that aren't incorporated into the core? Because the intent of the core is to impose any and all constraints that are part of the baseline, and also have additional constraints that are driven by the framework, because it is a core input into the framework itself. What I wanted to show is this invariant that we have on name in the baseline. So we say patient name given, so that would be like, this would be like your first name, name given, or patient name family, like your surname, or both shall be present. So what we are basically saying is this and or this have to be populated. And it's invariant that when we actually look at the strength, like we have a hint in here because it says shall. But when we look at the strength, we can see that, let me see if there's a better way of viewing this. I'll look at the JSON. The strength is an error strength, the way as it's written in the CA baseline. So I'll show it in the JSON because I think you can see it better that way.
So I think in some cases, certainly on the practitioner name, data absent reason was allowed. We didn't screen out data absent reason. So there are a few times when you don't have the name, which hence the data absent reason, but we didn't want to change or ask for changes in the invariant. We thought the invariant was appropriate, but we just wanted to be able to, in the cases where we needed to, use data absent reason.
Was that for the patient name, or you mentioned the practitioner name?
Well, I mean, the one where we found an error was the practitioner, but I can envision there might be a few unusual use cases where we don't have it for a patient name. So I think our profile still allows data absent reason in the baseline for name.
So it does allow it, but this invariant in the baseline doesn't account for it. So basically it will flag as an error if name given or name family or both aren't present.
Well, when the data absent reason is on name itself, then it doesn't come down and flag the invariant because it skips the whole element.
Oh, correct.
That's how the other one works, and that's perfect.
So would you use like a data absent reason in the case of like somebody comes in unconscious with no ID?
Potential, or something's masked for something, or yeah. You don't have a name for a reason, right? So you don't want to go into data absent reason on all the sub elements of name. You got a name or you don't. But if you got a name, it's got that some variant has to pass.
And so if this in the same vein, like is conditional in the sense where if there is a name present, this invariant comes into play. The thing I do want us to kind of evaluate is still that the invariant is looking at an either or scenario with an error expectation. And this one, based on the looking at the framework and understanding that name may also come through as text as an attribute, has patient name given, name family, or name text, and it has a should. And I'm going to give it a little bit of rationale. The should is primarily driven by the fact that we said we aren't going to apply any mandatory driven constraints because we don't have the respective kind of cardinality and expectations on the attributes yet. That isn't to say that this wouldn't become a shall in the future, just that we said, you know, until we have this view of strengths being applied from the framework, we weren't going to preempt any of those. So we went with a should. So it's an addition of name text, and it's a slight difference in the strength with that consideration. What I want to bring this forward to is, do we think that there is feedback that we want to provide from the perspective of our inclusion of name text in this, and or whether or not we are recommending a strengthening in the future that the framework should consider? The other way of thinking about this is like, would folks have been comfortable if you would have seen patient name given, name family, or name text shall be present? Is that what would have been desirable? Or are we comfortable with the strength kind of as it is and maybe less comfortable with the strength in the baseline? Because in some ways we've kind of said, oh, we've taken a stronger path in the baseline. And what I'm asking for is, are we asking for the same thing to be applied here?
And some of the summary is, should we be allowing the free text version of the name is part of the question.
Mm-hmm. What do folks think?
Well, I think if free text is available, then shouldn't we change it to say patient.text, patient.name given, or patient.name family?
You're saying that from the baseline's perspective, right, Joni?
I'm saying that from like a core perspective.
So the core has name given, name family, or name text.
Okay.
Yep. The base on the right-hand side is more restrictive.
Which means the core is technically not conformant to the baseline.
In this, yep, for this, and this is part of the reason I wanted to make sure we spent some time on this, because
Yeah, on
it
this
will likely
particular.
be strengthening, but there's
Yeah.
really two axes that we're looking at this for.
Sheridan, I had, I guess, kind of a big picture question that maybe ties into this, but I'm just curious how, maybe in IPA or other international profiles, this is handled. I'm just thinking something like patient name doesn't seem like something that would have a lot of Canadian specific considerations.
So that's a good point in the sense where, like we do see this coming up in profiles like US Core, which is part of why we originated it on the right-hand side in the base. But it isn't necessarily something that is driven by a uniqueness in the way that we convey our names, like we see in some European countries. So it's an invariant that is modeled after what we see in at least US Core. I'd have to see if the same is present in IPA. But I think regardless of that, at the end of the day, if our framework says we want to drive some consistency around what values that are structured are available for name, we also want to consider that as well, even if it's not necessarily driven by being Canadian in nature, like being a bilingual country. It is somewhat driven by being Canadian in nature as a reflection of the information model that we're trying to harmonize around and to develop for Canada. But we can take a look at IPA as well. So I'm just going to pull that up real quick for the patient name.
Thanks, Sheridan. And yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's just something to keep in mind that anything that is added does, I guess, any invariants or constraints that we add beyond like IPA, for example, can just incur additional cost for vendors and organizations trying to implement that. So just kind of weighing that balance, right?
Yep. And so I'll put this in the chat as well so you guys can have this on your end. So I've got patient for IPA pulled up on the right-hand side. So we see a similar, but maybe this is a little bit closer to what we see on our practitioner role. So name given and or family and or text shall be present, or that DAR that Lorraine was referring to, data absent reason. So Tony, would you be more likely to say, given the goal of us trying to kind of harmonize to what's in the baseline and what we're seeing internationally, you would put forward the ask that we try to harmonize around something that's closer to this, which would be both in IPA and closer to what we have in practitioner?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of an open-ended question and just something to keep in mind of just being thoughtful in terms of any differences we do introduce. Just the more that there are, the more potential costs that it incurs.
And Eric
But
just
if there,
put, oh, go ahead.
if there are, but yeah, if there are like legitimate reasons that, you know, we really think it should be different, then by all means, we should include them.
And I know, Eric, you just did a scan of IPS and it's the same. The path is given, family, or text. So this is kind of the first time I want to kind of go back to our processes and say, like, we've identified a difference, right? Between the CA baseline and the CA core, which we said we would do that kind of evaluation. And now I want to talk about whether or not we want to put forward like a request. So in looking at the can send no it, the must supports, that's been documented. So we reviewed the invariant in the CA baseline. On name and identified in strength and targets. So this would be like versus name, given, or text, and reviewed against international specification approach in IPA and IPS. This would be, so Eric, when you saw IPS, was it given family name, given family text or DAR? Or was it just given family text? Just given family text, okay.
But I would think that it would make sense to have the DAR as well. I mean, it's not necessarily a use case for primary health, but in a
But-
longer
But the
longer
DAR
term.
isn't on the sub-elements. The DAR is on the whole name, logically. Yeah. But I mean, we're allowing that in the baseline now.
So how I would phrase this is, like, we don't have to describe the exact way that we would want to see it, like the exact X path. But what I'm asking is, you know, is there someone who feels passionately that we should have our framework should have given family text or the ability to have some type of opt-out with DAR and under that kind of shall expectation.
I think that makes sense. I think like name is important, but there are use cases where you don't have a name and the DAR handles that.
So, how would you phrase that as like a request, Joni?
Match the invariant with what's on IPA.
Is there someone like, do we need more discussion around whether or not that's something that we do feel is the community feedback item and like whether or not we're comfortable with that recommendation? And if we don't need more discussion, is there someone that would second that request? Because it makes it easier for us to kind of land on a discrete, this is what we're recommending, or we still need time to talk about what a recommendation is.
If we add the DAR, does it break anything that currently exists, like patient summary or e-referral?
We'd certainly want to do that review of like the
We'd want to
application,
check, but I doubt it based on the way the constraints are there.
yeah.
But we'd want to check.
So Joni, you said specifically follow the approach that's outlined in IPA.
In IPA, yeah.
So before I formalize this, like, I won't record it unless we do have folks that, like somebody who does want to say, yeah, that makes sense. We could also run it with the Roberts rules to say, like, if we feel like we've had enough discussion on this and we've evaluated the options that we want to evaluate for this change request, we could run it with a abstain, negative, affirmative. Is anyone opposed to taking that approach? Okay, so on specifically the feedback item being submitted.
Thomas has his hand up.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, just sorry, just the first time in the new year I attend this meeting with a little bit, you know, a little bit slow, so, you know, a little bit slow, and also a little bit back. I just question, and maybe outside the scope of this one. It's what I heard actually now, for the City Core now has decided to adopt the obligation that how to say the obligation that fire obligation set already. That's what I heard. Is that right? Just want to confirm that.
Correct. We've identified the specific obligation terms and codes that align to and like the logic for those expectations. It's a more discrete way of talking about must support.
And I also actually been aware that actually the obligation that material is also now just at the mature level 1. And we decided, or actually, I don't know, for this community perspective, or maybe from the governance body above it, decided to be the early adopter of that obligation that materials. Just want to double check that's one on the same page. What my understanding.
Let's circle back to that one, Thomas, because so effectively there's a piece in the guide about like why we've chosen to use obligations, and that reflects that they are still very early maturity and are drivers behind why we do that. And if we want to, from the baseline perspective, capture feedback around whether or not we agree with that approach or whether or not we have concerns with that approach. But I do want to make sure that we first like tackle and close out this particular item before we circle back to that feedback.
Okay, just want to make sure that we have this discussion already, but maybe just want to confirm that it's been decided, and with all those information given information that we decided to be the early adopter. Just want to get that confirmed. That's okay. I just don't want to bother. Please continue the discussion. Thank you.
Okay. So circling back to the invariant piece. So we had looked at the modeling. I'm going to say should follow the approach of the IPA in the feedback, because I think it's worth evaluating is the DAR actually need to be claimed in the XPath? So I'm actually not going to say this particular XPath language if folks are comfortable with that. Is there anyone that would want to abstain from saying, yes, that's the feedback we want to put forward? Is there anyone that feels that they would vote negative or be opposed to this being the feedback we put forward?
Yeah, I was trying to get off mute. I'm not opposed to the overall solution. I just wonder if we want to reference from the baseline or core a specific use case implementation guide like IPA. That's my only concern in terms of how we word it.
Do you mean like in the feedback item?
Yes, I mean, we can say
guides
what
like
we want.
APA?
So we can say what we want, but should we say following the guidance like IPA? I don't know. I'm not sure about that.
Is there a different way that we should frame it?
Well, we just say what the IPA guidance is without referencing IPA, if that's what we want to do. I don't know. I mean,
We could always say use the same invariant.
well, why don't we just say use this invariant rather than the same one?
So the only reason I was recommending that we might avoid saying use this invariant is if we go back to IPA and look at whether or not they actually have to make a claim on DAR. That might change. depending on what you had mentioned earlier, Lorraine, its placement. So,
Yeah, and if IPA becomes more constrained in a specific use case, then all of a sudden the baseline is then tied. We have a dependency. I'm just concerned about the dependency. I don't have strong feelings about the solution. I think the solution's fine.
So what I put in this is patient summary, follow the approach of guides like IPA for enforcing a shall statement on given family or text. And then in parentheses, I said, or allow for DAR, but I'm not like putting the specifics of the XPath that it looked like that would follow that. Is anyone opposed to that statement as the feedback we want to submit? Okay. So in terms of like the actual places where there can be differences, because we've looked at must supports, we've looked at the invariant, there isn't terminology constraints. I think in terms of like potential differences, the only other place that I was going to call out is just that in the baseline, we make statements, let me go here, about there being like system and value for things like, I think it's like telecom, because they're, and I'm flagging this not as a difference, but more as a just a point in the approach, because we don't have kind of cardinality expectations yet for the framework. Those aren't called out explicitly. So in terms of like real differences that we can compare against, there really isn't much more from that perspective of the review. But we can look at things like within, telecom, within identifier, how things are compared slice-wise and what the implications of those are. So I wanted to spend just a little bit of time just scanning the approach and then seeing if people want to talk about it more. But effectively in the framework, and I'm going to scroll down to actually the example elements. So in the framework, we've got kind of, these were the elements and their definitions as of November. We've got like the term and then the description. I'm going to pull out like home address. So rather than there being like address and then address type, there is a concept for home address. And so the way and the approach where this has come up with things like telecom and things like home that's being put forward in the core is to develop a slice that is anchored around, in this case, use, right? To convey the expectation is that we are conveying or we have the capability of conveying when an address is home, and that we convey that using the use element. We know obviously then that gets broken down into many things for that given slice. So I'll show you like, this is what it actually looks like when it gets sliced.
So Sheridan, I think there is some review going on of the data content framework around name and telecom with the uses and types.
Yep. Yeah, so important to note that like this is as of November, and we know that as part of getting to be early reviewers and trying to translate this into FHIR and like iterate alongside the framework, that this will change alongside of it. But what our goal is just to kind of provide feedback at the kind of point in time pieces. But that's helpful to know, like, so around like you're saying like the typing of a given home address, then Joni is what.
Yeah, I think we're looking to change it to address and then have a use for the address. That way it gives you the flexibility to have multiple kinds of addresses, and we're looking at doing the same in telecom as well.
Yeah. So if we look at telecom
and for name as well, because name has a use as well.
Yeah. So telecom, the attribute was primary phone number and alternate phone number. And so the way that it's been modeled based off of that at that point in time is to use the actual slicing that is in this case, it was slightly different. We use slicing based off of having a extension applied for the primary, because there is an ISO international extension that is often used with telecom to identify, whether or not something is the preferred telecom system or the preferred address. So
I think we're also looking at using rank and period.
so let's so obviously there's quite a lot that we have available to ourselves. The
Yeah,
way that this is currently modeled, and let's talk about it, because I mean, Joni, to your point and what Eric had said, is maybe the mapping that is appropriate for this value is rank rather than preferred. So there's a slice that describes, okay, this is phone, that just essentially says this is a fixed value based on the system of phone versus email. And I'll kind of have to like slide a little bit to the right so you can actually see it. And then there isn't really, other than the application and the pointing out of this preferred extension, there aren't further expectations that are tied to what needs to be supported within the phone or the email slice. So when we look at primary phone number, the person's phone number, and the alternate phone number, do we think that rank is a better choice given how perhaps our current systems are utilizing this today, potentially over the preferred extension to convey that concept? Are there folks that are using like that rank already to kind of convey this is the primary, and then anything that isn't maybe one is an alternate? Eric, you had mentioned, like, you had asked about rank. From a implementer's perspective, obviously harmonization around how we convey this is going to be really key. Is there a driver behind the liking rank more than something like preferred, which might be utilized in other contexts, given it comes from one of the ISO standards, I think, on data type, but only conveys whether or not it's a true or a false for that preferred phone number for a person?
Yeah, the context can be a little bit different because the rank, you can have multiple fallbacks. So you could have like first and then second and
Yeah, and yeah, I agree with you. And the other thing is that telecom is not just phone numbers, right?
Yeah.
Telecom is also emails and other things. So you actually could have a rank of 1 on both your telephone and one of your emails, theoretically. I have forgotten whether there's an extension for this in the Firespace spec. I haven't looked at this part in a long time.
So there is an extension for preferred, and it can be applied to contact point. So it can be applied to telecom. It can be applied, I think, to address and to
Definitely has synergies to work, but
Yeah.
go ahead and put
Oh, sorry. Was there a comment there? Oh, Christine, you might want to mute.
Sorry about that.
Perfect. Okay. So yes, Lorraine, to answer your question, like, there is something that kind of fits the bill. The problem is that, like, this element doesn't say preferred, and it also doesn't say rank. And so in some ways, when we're thinking about what feedback to provide, we're assessing whether or not, one is more preferable as the kind of closest way of getting at this that will also promote harmonization within like other practices.
but I see the rank, it's more for primary, alternate, and all that, and preferred could be the preferred way of like how you want, how the patient wants you to communicate with him, which could be an email or mobile or phone number. So
that could also be encapsulated within telecom, where you would set the preferred phone. If you want to be contacted by phone, then the phone number gets rank 1 and the email gets rank 2.
Yes, yeah.
So is there an alternative? And I'll pull up our Excel sheet. So. When reviewing home or no, sorry, it was primary alternate telecom. Extension. Is there a recommendation to modify the way that it's been mapped to switch over to rank as the better interpretation and better use of this concept?
I'm not sure if I can say it's better because I haven't used that preferred extension, but I know that with the rank, I was able to implement what I wanted.
And it's already something, Eric, you said you've had within your implementation.
Yes, correct.
So what would folks like to do? Is there somebody who would second the recommendation that we consider rank as an alternative way of describing this concept in Fire? Do we feel like we would need more discussion?
I know I'm waiting to see what our modelers come back with when they finish their modeling of person, so I don't really want to weigh in yet.
Actually, maybe the way of asking this is it an either or scenario? Or like, I think what folks were describing is like, is what we're recommending the ability to do both, to talk about a ranking and to be allowed, convey recommended, or sorry, preferred. That's what the extension is, not recommended. So are we asking for separation of this concept so that we're more squarely using rank for what rank is for and preferred for what preferred is for?
Again, I
Yeah.
don't want to weigh in personally until I see how our architecture people model it.
I saw Eric, you went off mute.
Well, yeah, I was wondering if it makes that mandatory to support both. Because you cannot, well, in theory, you could map from ranking to preferred and back and forth, but maybe not support them both at the same time.
Maybe as Johnny said, so maybe we should keep both options open and let modeler to decide, kind of thing. Although it's good to have both, basically. Not sure.
Well, I mean, in theory, you can, in your backend, you can map like rank 1 to preferred and vice versa, right? So I just want to see
Correct, yeah.
how what's going to be recommended by the people who do that for a living.
Yeah, basically it will give them an opportunity to think, okay, as you said, it's correct, yeah.
To Eric's point, so I think what I'm hearing is like evaluate both the term for revision against how we understand rank or preferred. Seems like a safe place, but to Eric's point, you know, we have this logic where if it's identified as an attribute, it's going to carry a can send no error obligation code with our currently logic as proposed. That's something that we can also have feedback on. But what that would mean is if we recommend splitting it and having both, that means that there's an expectation to be able to have default behavior for both of those concepts. And so I want to make sure I know where folks are landing and if that's something that we're asking for in our feedback, or if we're saying like, we probably need one and we're asking for evaluation of one or the other.
What I'm struggling with here is the usage, like preferred, because telecom is emails and phone numbers, and I think other things. You could have a preferred email and a preferred phone number. But I want to be talked, my first one is to use email, and if you can't get, or first one is to use phone. If you can't get me by phone, then use email, but here's the preferred email. Like, so you could have, if you use both, you can make it complicated.
Yeah, if I was doing that, I would enter you said phone was your preferred, I would enter the phone as rank 1 and the email as rank 2.
And then potentially have the phone as preferred, so you know which phone number to try first.
No, if you had multiple phone numbers, each phone number would have its own use. Like each phone number would have
Yeah.
its own system in use. And then you would give each phone number a rank.
Okay.
So we don't have the option of message or the text, basically. Means
One more
like
time, Mukesh?
means message on your phone and you get email if you see the Microsoft environment these days, they send you an email and you get the message on your phone if you have picked phone as your preference. So you get a message on the phone and the email into your email box. So both goes simultaneously.
Well, I mean, that would be an application function to send to both. I don't know that the ranking and preferred stuff would affect that. You'd have a business rule if you're going to try to send to both of them, I think.
So do we feel stronger about saying we think it should probably just, whatever the choice that it's used, we should probably stick to one so that we don't introduce implementation variations around how the combination of both are used? Or do we feel stronger about like having clear separation of what both is intended to do and having those considered in the framework?
I don't think I have enough evidence to say one way or the other.
So keep both at this one.
I heard one both. I heard Eric, you said same. Same to
I'm
both?
up for evaluating both.
Yeah, same.
Same for me.
Are folks uncomfortable with the way I've phrased this feedback? So we reviewed specifically this extension and we're recommending a clearer description and looking at anchoring it in how rank and preferred are being used so that there is potentially less interpretation that would vacillate between the two, with additional consideration on the separation of this into more than one concept. Is anyone uncomfortable with that? And would want to abstain? Would anyone feel that they would not be okay with that being put forward for feedback and would consider that like they're negative? Okay. I have another one that hopefully we can talk about in the next 10 minutes because it's the other. So this was a big one. We had a good discussion last week about patient text and we didn't get to close it out. So I wanted to just take a look at recapping this and seeing if we have a formal recommendation or ask that we want to put forward. So with the patient, let's see, patient notes attribute, which we looked at last time. Here it is, person notes. General comments or textual description about the patient. the way that this is currently mapped and modeled is that it's identified with patient.text. So within the domain resource, there is a narrative element that can be utilized. And the expectation that, you know, you convey a notes about a person using a narrative that has a status of additional that's applied on patient.text. It was a controversial discussion because, you know, we recognize that, I mean, technically it's a map to what's being asked for. You can convey additional information about the patient in that, but folks didn't really seem too keen about applying additional expectations for the text element when we have things like observations and document references where we can convey additional kind of notes for attribute or for profile, sorry, for resources that don't already have a notes element. So what I wanted
Yeah.
to do is capture that formally as feedback and see what it is if we're saying change the modeling to something else, what you should recommend as a consideration.
Could we have just a generic notes extension that we could put on any resource that doesn't have a notes?
Well, so we could ask for that. A lot of resources do have notes, and then sometimes the annotation itself is an extension, although most of the time I think the notes are type annotation. But you know, for consistency, I would far rather see this, even if we have to do an extension, to be in a notes element that's maybe an extension. I know patient doesn't have notes. I think it's more expected by implementers. And yes, it's true that that mapping is a valid mapping, but I don't think it's consistent with how we do things elsewhere in the spec.
So are we recommend, because the other piece that I heard as an option that that Elliot brought up last week that I didn't hear to date was observations. So, you know, oftentimes when we don't have that option, and this would be true for like practitioner, organization, patient that don't have the dot notes, there is the ability to convey that as an observation, right? You're giving me details about a patient that isn't part of its structured resource. Or like through document reference, like this is a document that it's actually a recording of the notes about this patient.
Yeah, here, let me put you mute. No. Okay, sorry, we just deprived the dog of its toy.
But more thanks you.
Yes, I'm sort of reluctant to go the observation route. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that come under the patient characteristics that may be observations or maybe something else. And there's actually a project working on that as anatomic inventory and patient characteristics. But just with my OO head on, observation doesn't feel natural for this. But that's, you know, a personal opinion.
The text, my understanding, there should be no any clinical, financial information included.
Well, sometimes there is clinical information in the notes, particularly if you can't describe, you know, a specific clinical item without adding explanatory text.
Then it shall not be in this patient.text. It should be somewhere else.
Yeah.
No clinical, no financial information should be in the patient.text.
Yeah. And observation does have its own notes field.
Is patient.text one of like the metadata?
Well, no, it's
in
every resource has a text area that's the human readable narrative. Lots of people don't pay very much attention to it or just generate it from the structured content. But as Elliot pointed out last week, you can't say there's additional information there and put information in there. I just don't think it's the expected place to find this kind of thing.
And the other
Yeah.
reason,
It's
It's
conforming.
more about the resource as a whole rather than the patient.
Well, we're talking about patient resource, so we're talking about the resource as a whole.
Yeah, but more, I think,
so one clear downside to this, particularly, even if like legalistically it's possible, is that there's one text, right? One narrative per resource. And a lot of times what we see is that folks are using narrative and they're using narrative with the code of generated, meaning this is a summation of the summary elements that show up in the structured fields. Requiring, you know, the use of additional here would mean that there might be a choice that that an implementation has to make to change from its default behavior when there is notes that is probably less desirable.
Yeah. You're
given
gonna have to
constraint.
check what the, whether the narrative.txt or resource.txt has a, is generated or is additional or is human. And if it's actually human edited, all bets are off. You don't know, right?
So if
I
we're
think,
not,
I think what Sheridan was just showing is that there's different options for it.
yeah, and that,
Yeah.
and if we can't,
But you're gonna have
align-
to check that option every time if we allow this, right?
potentially, yeah. So
Yeah.
if we're not sure about whether or not, you know, observation or extension or a document reference is the right fit, is there a different way of wording this feedback about how we recommend the core and the framework identify the right fit for this? So the feedback might be, we don't like the option that you've chosen. We'd like you to pursue an alternative mapping.
And we
we'd
consider,
like you to
and we
prioritize this.
consider a notes extension.
Well, I guess the what I'm proposing is an alternative to calling out the choice, but if we are comfortable saying this is the choice that we want to make and put it forward, then I can make that work as well. Is the asking for the extension as a way of conveying this when we see it come up for patient and practitioner? Like, is that the recommendation we want to put forward?
At least for this patient.txt, as you just mentioned, Sheridan, there's three different type of categories cannot be included: clinical, financial, and any other IID, individual identifiable information, as mentioned, practitioner, provider, payers, all those information shall never be in this .txt.
I think that's separate from, so that's part of the driving philosophy you're saying behind not fitting it here. What I'm asking for is whether or not we're suggesting an alternative, like specifically. So do we want to suggest extensions or observation or something else as an alternative? I've heard Joni say she would suggest extension as an alternative over.
Well, there
And,
should be
and,
no
and
extension.
I would do a generic notes extension that can be an extension on any resource that doesn't have a notes already.
Well, that might be in terms of our scope here, stepping broader than we want to, but yeah, I'd support the notes extension piece, though. I think it's more consistent with how we deal with these kinds of concepts in other resources. And I could see hoping that that extension got promoted to core in the international build as we
Well,
move along, right?
Exactly.
the extension here still cannot capture all those information, because actually if you use extension to allow to capture across different categories, that means this administration section category patient can include information from clinical category, from the financial category, and from other administrative other IED provider information. That will be, there will be potential risk there. I would say there's very potential risk there. So
Yeah,
this
but I
extension
think
will be there.
I think that's a different question that's related, but not exactly what we're talking about.
do we think that we still need more discussion on this particular recommendation before we, like, basically the way I've worded it is, consider an extension for notes, you know, obviously with the goal of it being reused and ideally promoted. Maybe we start, so we know that we have, I'm looking at the time. There's probably 2 items, so closing out this and maybe one more place that, like, I know that we should take a look at for patient. We also want to do the scan and make sure that we've given a chance to look through the remainder of the items too. We have one session that could be a buffer right now. Like, do we want to return to patient next session? Start by confirming everybody's comfortable with this particular feedback item as it's written. And then touch on some of the other areas that we didn't get a chance to touch on today. And if we have time, we'll start potentially practitioner in the like second half or last quarter of the call for next Friday. I can put this as a color that tells us like we've got to still validate this one. Anyone opposed to that approach? Because we want to give folks like a chance to kind of, you know, we are submitting this as a community, so to chew on this and to not put it as a pressure under the hour. There are a couple other places I think it might be valuable for us to talk about, like the extension on for effective, a potential replacement for that, and a couple other places. And I just don't want to have to rush through the remainder of patient if we've got the time to kind of work through it. All right. If no one's opposed, that will be our plan for next session. I'll stop the recording. It'll be available in the next hour or so.